Imagine you are standing in a sleek, glass-walled office in San Mateo, California, looking at a spreadsheet that is bleeding bright red. It is the spring of 2016, and the company you are watching, SolarCity, is the biggest residential solar installer in the country. But there is a massive problem behind the rows of shiny blue panels. For every $10 the company brings in, it is spending about $11 just to keep the lights on. In fact, by the second quarter of that year, the company would report a staggering net loss of $250 million on just $186 million in revenue. You probably think of solar power as a way to save the planet, but at this exact moment, the only thing that needs saving is the bank account of Elon Musk's cousins. The big mystery that still hangs over this era is how a struggling solar installer managed to convince the world it was worth a multi-billion-dollar rescue mission from an electric car company. The situation inside SolarCity was getting desperate. Lyndon Reeve, the CEO and Musk's first cousin, was privately telling Elon that the company needed roughly $300 million just to stay afloat. They were trapped in a brutal business model. They would install solar panels for free and then wait 20 years for homeowners to pay them back in small monthly increments. It was great for growth, but it was a disaster for cash flow. By mid-2016, their cash reserves had shriveled to about $146 million, which is basically pocket change for a company with thousands of employees and billions in debt. To keep the ship from sinking, Musk's other company, SpaceX, started buying up hundreds of millions of dollars in solar bonds issued by SolarCity. It was a bit like one sibling lending the other gas money so they don't have to admit to their parents that they're broke. Even with that help, the walls were closing in. Lenders were getting nervous and the stock price was sliding. SolarCity was essentially a high-speed train running out of track, and the only person with a big enough crane to move the tracks was Elon Musk. This is where the drama really shifts into high gear. While the public saw a visionary leader talking about a clean energy future, the internal reality was a frantic scramble for survival. Finance people still go back and forth on whether SolarCity was truly insolvent at this point, or just experiencing a temporary liquidity crunch that any fast-growing startup might face. Some argue that the company had plenty of valuable assets, those 20-year contracts, that were worth billions on paper. Others point to the fact that auditors later suggested the company didn't have enough cash to meet its obligations as a standalone business. The tension reached a breaking point in June 2016. Tesla's board of directors met to discuss a potential takeover. On one side, you had a car company that was finally starting to find its rhythm with the Model S and Model X. On the other, you had a solar company that was practically on life support. To the outside observer, merging the two looked like attaching a lead weight to a marathon runner, but Musk presented it as a no-brainer vertical integration. He envisioned a world where you could drive your Tesla home, park it under a solar roof, and charge it using power stored in a Tesla battery. It was a beautiful vision, but the timing was suspicious to say the least. If SolarCity failed, Musk stood to lose over $500 million of his own wealth, not to mention the reputational hit of seeing his cousin's business go under. The stakes couldn't have been higher. You trace the timeline and realize that the deal wasn't just about business strategy. It was a race against a ticking clock. If Tesla didn't step in, the SolarCity fire was going to consume everything the Reeve brothers had built. Tesla's boardroom in 2016 wasn't just a place for discussing car designs. It was a tangle of family ties and overlapping fortunes. 6 out of the 7 board members had direct connections to SolarCity. Some held stock in both companies. Others were early investors who had helped the Reeve brothers get started. This created a massive conflict of interest from the very beginning. Here's the thing about corporate governance. It is supposed to protect shareholders from lopsided deals. But in this case, the lines were incredibly blurry. The official offer to buy SolarCity came in at roughly $2.6 billion in Tesla stock. That is enough capital to build a dozen massive skyscrapers in a major city. When the news hit the public, the market reaction was swift and brutal. Tesla's stock price immediately plummeted by more than 10%. Investors were essentially shouting that this deal made no financial sense. They saw it as a bailout for a failing relative, not a strategic masterstroke. You look at the financial charts from that day and see a giant cliff where value used to be. Musk insisted on recusing himself from the final vote to keep things clean. He wanted to show the world that the decision was truly independent. However, he was still the one driving the entire vision for the new Tesla. He called the merger a no-brainer during public conference calls with investors. He promised that the combined company would be a one-stop shop for clean energy. It sounded like a revolution in a press release. But behind closed doors, the math was much harder to justify. The tension during these summer weeks was intense. Short sellers were circling the company like sharks in shallow water. They smelled blood because they believed SolarCity would go bankrupt before the deal could close. If the solar company collapsed, it might pull Tesla down with it. Musk had to move fast to keep the narrative from falling apart. He needed to convince the public that SolarCity wasn't a dying utility installer. You notice how he shifted the focus toward a high-tech future instead of current losses. Analysts still argue about whether the board of directors actually performed their fiduciary duty or simply followed Musk's lead. Some court filings later showed that the board didn't even bother to look at other solar companies. They only wanted SolarCity. This raised serious questions among legal experts at the time. Was this a calculated business move or a massive family favor? You can almost feel the pressure the board was under to deliver a win for their chairman. The independent committee at Tesla was supposed to be the watchdog for the shareholders, but even they were using financial projections provided by SolarCity's own management team. It is a bit like asking a baker to appraise the value of their own bread. Of course, they are going to give you a glowing report. The whole process felt like a foregone conclusion to many observers. The momentum was building, but the public still needed a reason to believe in the dream. They needed a wow moment that looked like the future. This set the stage for a product launch that would change the conversation entirely. On a warm October night in 2016, a crowd of investors and journalists gathered at Universal Studios Hollywood for what felt like a movie premiere. But they weren't there for a film. They were standing on the famous backlot street known as Wisteria Lane, the iconic setting of the show Desperate Housewives. The atmosphere was electric. You watch as Elon Musk walks onto the stage, surrounded by perfectly manicured suburban homes. He points to the rooftops and asks the audience if they notice anything unusual. To the naked eye, the houses look completely normal. They have beautiful high-end shingles and styles like Tuscan glass and slate. Then comes the big reveal. Those aren't just roofs. Every single one of them is made of solar tiles. It was a masterclass in showmanship. Musk was pitching a world where you didn't have to choose between a beautiful home and clean energy. He claimed these glass tiles were more durable than regular shingles and would eventually cost less than a traditional roof, plus the price of electricity. It was the wow factor the SolarCity deal desperately needed. At that moment, the skepticism of the summer seemed to evaporate. If this technology was real and ready to go, the merger wasn't a bailout. It was a bargain. However, as the sun went down on Wisteria Lane, the reality was a lot more complicated. Behind the scenes, the solar roof was essentially a collection of handcrafted prototypes. Reports later surfaced suggesting that the tiles on those houses weren't actually generating power for the buildings below. They were beautiful props in a very expensive stage play. Some employees later testified that the internal teams were blindsided by the event, having been given very little time to create anything that actually worked. This created a massive divide in how people viewed the event. There's still a real disagreement on whether this was a visionary fake-it-till-you-make-it moment or a calculated move to mislead shareholders before a critical vote. Supporters argue that every tech company uses prototypes for launches. They say Musk was simply showing the world the potential of the product, not claiming it was in mass production that very night. On the other hand, critics point out that the timing was just too perfect. The shareholder vote was only a few weeks away, and SolarCity was days away from a total financial collapse. The magic tiles worked their magic. On November 17, 2016, Tesla shareholders met to decide the fate of the merger. Despite the red flags and the plunging stock price earlier that year, the vote wasn't even close. More than 85% of unaffiliated shareholders approved the $2.6 billion acquisition. You look at the final tally and realize that the vision of an integrated sun-to-car ecosystem had successfully drowned out the warnings from the bean counters. Musk had won. SolarCity was officially folded into Tesla, and the Rive Brothers company was saved from the brink of bankruptcy. But as the cheers died down, the hard work of actually building those roofs had to begin. It's one thing to tile a movie set for a one-night event. It's another thing entirely to manufacture millions of high-tech shingles that can survive 30 years of rain, hail, and wind. The focus now shifted from the glamour of Hollywood to a cold, massive factory in Buffalo, New York. The deal was done, but the real test of whether this was a stroke of genius or a billion-dollar mistake was just starting to unfold in the industrial heartland of America. After the glitz of Hollywood, the story moves to a sprawling, 1.2 million square foot facility in South Buffalo, New York. This factory, often called Giga New York, was supposed to be the beating heart of the American solar revolution. The state of New York didn't just hope for success. They bet the house on it, pouring nearly $1 billion in taxpayer money into the project. It was part of a massive economic revitalization plan nicknamed the Buffalo Billion. The promise was simple. In exchange for this incredible investment, the factory would create thousands of high-tech manufacturing jobs and churn out enough solar panels to cover every roof in the country. But for years, if you looked at the map of Buffalo, you'd see a factory that looked more like a ghost of a dream than a cutting-edge hub. While Musk was selling the vision of the solar roof, the actual production lines in Buffalo were struggling. The glass tiles were notoriously difficult to manufacture at scale. They were heavy, expensive, and the failure rate during production was reportedly quite high. Instead of thousands of workers building solar panels, the factory spent long stretches of time underutilized. At one point, reports surfaced showing that the solar panels installed on the factory's own roof weren't even made by Tesla. They were standard panels from a rival company, which felt like a punch in the gut to the local community that had funded the building. To meet the strict job requirements set by the state, Tesla had to get creative. They started shifting the factory's focus away from solar and toward other parts of the business. Suddenly, the solar plant was producing electrical cabinets for the supercharger network and housing hundreds of people whose primary job was data labeling. These workers weren't building hardware. They were sitting at desks, manually identifying stop signs and pedestrians in videos to help train Tesla's autopilot system. You noticed the massive footprint of the building and realized the original solar dream had quietly morphed into a support hub for electric cars and artificial intelligence. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the Buffalo investment was a total failure or a complicated success. On one hand, Tesla did eventually meet its employment targets, avoiding millions of dollars in penalties. On the other hand, those jobs weren't the green manufacturing roles that were promised to the public back in 2014. Some economists argued that the state essentially paid $500,000 per job created, which is an astronomical price tag for taxpayer-funded economic development. By 2024 and 2025, the shift toward AI became even more permanent. Tesla announced a fresh $500 million investment to build a Dojo supercomputer cluster right there in Buffalo. It seemed like the solar mission was being left in the rearview mirror for good. But then, in early 2026, the story took another unexpected turn. New reports and filings showed that Tesla was finally bringing solar manufacturing back to the floor with a new product called the TSP420. It isn't the flashy solar shingle from the movie set, but a high-efficiency American-made solar panel. It is a full-circle moment, but it comes a decade after the original promise. You might wonder if the taxpayers got a raw deal, or if this slow-motion recovery is just how hard-tech manufacturing works in the real world. Even as the factory finally finds its footing with these new panels, the shadow of the 2016 deal hasn't disappeared. While the Buffalo plant was pivoting to survive, a group of angry investors was preparing to take Musk to court. They claimed the entire SolarCity merger was a massive bailout that only benefited one person, and they were determined to make him pay it all back. While the Buffalo factory was busy reinventing itself, the ghost of the 2016 deal finally caught up with Elon Musk in a courtroom in Wilmington, Delaware. A group of Tesla shareholders had filed a massive lawsuit, claiming that Musk had pressured the board into buying SolarCity just to save his own skin and his cousin's company. They weren't asking for an apology, they were asking for him to pay back the entire $2.6 billion out of his own pocket. You can imagine the tension in that room. This wasn't a quick settlement. It was a multi-year legal war that culminated in a high-stakes trial where Musk himself had to take the stand for days. During the trial, the world got a rare, unfiltered look at how Tesla actually operates. Lawyers for the shareholders painted a picture of a controlling shareholder who dominated a weak board of directors. They argued that the board didn't look at any other companies because Musk had already decided SolarCity was the one. But when Musk took the stand, he didn't back down. He argued that he had no power to fire board members or set their compensation, so he couldn't possibly be a controller in the legal sense. He insisted the merger was part of a master plan he had written years prior. The drama in the courtroom was palpable. At one point, Musk openly sparred with the plaintiff's attorney, calling his questions deceptive and even mocking his legal pedigree. It was classic Musk, defiant, aggressive, and totally convinced of his own vision. You see the conflict clearly here. It was a battle between the rigid rules of a corporate law and the chaotic energy of a visionary founder. The judge had to decide if the solar roof reveal was a genuine product launch or a piece of evidence in a multi-billion-dollar fraud. In April 2022, the verdict finally came down. Vice Chancellor Joseph Slights III ruled in favor of Musk. The judge acknowledged that Musk was heavily involved in the process, more than would be ideal, but ultimately decided that Tesla had not overpaid for SolarCity. He noted that while the process was imperfect, the deal was entirely fair to Tesla shareholders. Musk had dodged a $2 billion bullet. It was a massive victory that solidified his control over his empire, proving that in the eyes of the law, a visionary's big picture can sometimes outweigh messy spreadsheets and family ties. Finance people still go back and forth on whether this ruling set a dangerous precedent for corporate governance in America. Some argue it gives powerful CEOs a blank check to bail out their other ventures as long as they can frame it as a long-term vision. Others believe the court was right to respect the will of the shareholders, who, after all, had overwhelmingly voted for the deal. Even today, as you look at Tesla's energy division, the debate persists. Is it a thriving part of the business, or just a lingering reminder of a family rescue mission? The SolarCity story is a wild ride of billionaire risks, Hollywood-style stunts, and taxpayer-funded dreams. It shows how one man's refusal to let a company fail can reshape an entire industry, for better or worse. Whether you see it as a brilliant strategic move or a lucky escape, there's no denying that the $2.6 billion lifeboat changed the course of Tesla forever. Now that we've traced the path from a bleeding spreadsheet in California to a high-tech supercomputer hub in Buffalo, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Everyone's economic reality looks a little different right now, so feel free to share how things are looking in your neck of the woods. Are you seeing more solar panels popping up in your neighborhood, or are people still waiting for that perfect roof to finally arrive? If you have a big move or a new project planned for the coming months, drop a comment and let us know what's on your horizon. It's always fascinating to see how these global economic stories connect to our day-to-day lives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the messy intersection of family and finance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep telling these stories. And if you want to make sure you don't miss our next breakdown of the deals that shape our world, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more on the way, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.